What Dr. Anderson did made me uncomfortable. He fondled my genitals and conducted an invasive rectal exam with his finger. Bo's temper was legendary, and he lost it. He screamed, "I don't want to hear this. I'm not hearing this." I tried to tell him repeatedly, but my effort earned me a punch in the chest. I don't hate Bo. As people try to pay me that, I just don't like him.
Those were the words that no one expected to hear from the stepson, the adopted son of legendary U of M football coach Bo Schembeckler. It calls into question what we thought we knew about Bo and the team. Time to let it rip. On the panel tonight, the attorney now representing many of the survivors of the sexual abuse that went on for so long, John Marco. To help us understand how this could happen, psychiatrist Dr. Gerald Shiner, plus attorney Charlie Langton. But we begin tonight with one of those survivors, Dan Kudakowski, who was an offensive lineman for Michigan from 1977 to 79. Dan, what happened? When did this nightmare begin for you?
Well, the nightmare began, I wouldn't consider it a total nightmare, but it all began when Bo first started recruiting me back in 1977. He promised my family that he would take care of me, that he would get me a quality education, handle all my medical bills, and make sure that I graduated from the University of Michigan. Well, to my dismay, at my first physical, I was sexually abused. And I'm not talking about something that a 17 or 18-year-old boys probably never had done to them in their lives. He fondled my testicles and was asking me several questions about my sex life because he found that the way my testicles hung must have interested him, because he was asking about how much sex I had a week and how often and how many different partners, a lot of things that I was very uncomfortable with coming from where I did back in that time. And then while he was examining my penis, he bent down and started to blow on it. And then he immediately turned me to put my hands on the table and inserted his finger into my rectum. And I don't know for how long that lasted until I grabbed his hand and pulled it out. And that was my first experience with Dr. Anderson. I pulled up my pants after I pulled his hand out. I was screaming in pain and terror. And then I left the office. As I was walking home back to my dorm room, as thoughts were going through my head, I felt that I was abused. So a few weeks later, after I talked to other guys on the team and talked about how did your thing go, I was having a good practice. I went up to Bo. I asked him, what about the fingers in the butt with Dr. Anderson? He told me to toughen up, and that was it. I knew I was going to be on my own. And so then that's the way my career started at Michigan.
So in your estimation, Bo knew and did nothing.
In my estimation, everybody knew and did nothing. But Bo, yes, he had to know.
Dan,
I know I told him, but but you have to understand, Bo was a disciplinarian, so it was very hard to speak with him. And when he said no, no was no. If he told you to toughen up, you toughened up. If he told you the conversation was over, the conversation was over. I'm sure a lot of you guys were closer to Bo than a lot of his players, because we were the chess pieces in his game of football.
John, let me bring you in here, because now we are hearing that there are more than 850 who have come forward with the same story that Dan is telling, the story of abuse and denial. How could this have gone on for so long?
There's a saying that evil triumphs when good men do nothing. And in this case, it was a systemic problem. I mean, there was all the way back in 1968, 1969, the warning bells were going off at University of Michigan. In 1979, they fired Anderson after some young gay men had made an allegation that he engaged in inappropriate sexual activities with them, but then they reversed that decision and they brought him back. And so this wasn't an isolated incident. This was where there were warning bells were going off for decades. And the University of Michigan not only failed to act, but they made a safe place for this predator. And predators often go where they can be safe, where they can get away with their actions. And that's exactly what happened here. You see it in the Catholic Church with the priest epidemics. You see it in the Boy Scouts that's coming out. And we see it at the University of Michigan. And nobody did anything. It's not just Bo. I mean, it is, there were so many people who had the ability to do something and they did nothing.
Well, Dr. Shiner, we saw a similar case happen at MSU involving Dr. Larry Nassar. Now, many of the women who complained did so within a few years of their abuse, but it has taken decades for many of these men to come forward. Why is that?
Disclosing is always difficult. It's more difficult for men because women are the object of an image of frail, needing protection, vulnerability. Men, especially athletes, strong, adequate, capable, and to come out and say, I've been victimized, I've been touched, I've been bothered, is incredibly difficult. People are unlikely to disclose, and predators know this. They pick the most vulnerable victims, they make them vulnerable, and they know they're not going to squeal, they know they're not going to say anything because they're too proud. Now, we will not remember the actions of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. And there is a conspiracy of silence. This is someone who had esteem. He was part of the medical school. He's part of the medical community in Ann Arbor, as elite as it gets. And he served a purpose for the team. The team knows that what he says goes, what the coach says goes, and they have power over the players. You can play or not play. So all of these things go into the mix of how it happened. And strong men can't admit their own weakness. We put a lot of pressure on them. We put them on a pedestal, and it's hard for them to disclose. And there's a lot of shame and embarrassment, humiliation associated with the victimhood.
Well, Charlie Langton, you were at the news conference today. Perhaps that is why, at the age of 60 plus, Matt Schembeckler is finally revealing to the world what happened to him. He, too, says he was abused at the hands of Dr. Robert Anderson and that he told his father, but his father, Bo, apparently didn't want to hear it.
In fact, he said that his father, Bo, punched him in the stomach and said, get out of here, toughen up, and not so many words. Listen, I am not going to defend the University of Michigan. I cannot do that. I don't know what happened. I give some credit to the judge. There's a lawsuit pending right now. There's somewhat of a gag order. They can't get into details of it, but the judge said, let's mediate this case. Let's see if there's some issues that we can come together and perhaps resolve this case, as they did at Michigan State with Larry Nassar. But the bottom line here is that there's been some tension between Matt and Bo for many years. In fact, in 1999, Matt Schembeckler sued his father and the University of Michigan over some memorabilia company that he was trying to get off the ground. The judge threw that case out. But you could tell that there is still animosity between the two of them. In fact, I asked him, what do you think Bo would say to you for saying all these allegations? And basically said, listen, I don't care. And whatever Bo says, I don't hate him, but I don't like him. But that's credibility. So U of M is being sued. They're going to have some defenses. This was long ago. There's animosity, etc. But the bottom line here is that I hope that the mediation process can take its course, because this is a PR disaster for the University of Michigan, or potentially for the University of Michigan.
Well, Dan, I know what happened to you happened decades ago, but did it affect your adult life? Did it affect your relationships, your family?
Well, sure it did. I got two sons, and they both played sports all the way through college. And even when they're in the young programs, high school and grade school, after every physical, I would ask them if they got fingered in the butt by the doctor. Did he violate you? For all those years, that's just one incident where it affected my life, and it has affected it in a lot of other ways. But I don't want to bore you here tonight with all my problems.
Well, that's why we have John Marco here. Because, John, how do you put a price tag on what has happened to these men, these victims?
I don't think you can. And, one of the things that we're seeking here is accountability. Accountability, not just, it's easy to blame Dr. Anderson. Of course, what he did was horrible. But to say, to blame this predator who has passed away, and for the other people who were involved along the way to not take accountability, that's not right. It's not just Dr. Anderson. He may be the wolf in the hen house, but what about the people that put him there and allowed him to stay there and didn't take him out of there? There needs to be some accountability for those people, for the University of Michigan. There needs to be some justice for these victims, and there needs to be some changes so that this can never happen again. 900 people nearly, and it's taken this long for these allegations to come out.
But John, is this happening today? I mean, Dr. Robert Anderson has been dead since 2006. It's a long time ago. Bo Schembeckler has been dead for a long, long time. Why should the University of Michigan today have to pay for the evils that did or likely happen?
I'll tell you why, Charlie. Charlie, perpetrators have to know that whatever they do, we'll find them and we'll hold them accountable. Victims have to know that what happened to them has to come out, and they need some comfort. They need to be able to forgive themselves, and they need to show that it wasn't their fault. And everyone who is complicit, everyone who stood by, everyone who knew what was going on and did nothing, has to stand and face the public and face what they did. That was what the Nuremberg trials did. And if you think this isn't going on today at high schools, in churches, in athletic groups, in church choirs, we see these cases all the time. These make publicity with a lot of victims and someone very prominent. But for every private high school, every small a church who lets a youth minister seduce girls or touch boys, who lets the coach who has a Corvette and lets a 14-year-old kid drive it around the parking lot, ends up having a sleepover. That's going on today. I'll bet that's happening tonight because I've heard about it enough, and I see it in patients who have been suffering all their life, adults who don't know why they can't hold a job, why they can't stop drinking, why they can't maintain relationships. And when this comes out, it's a relief, it's a release for them, and it's a way for them to start to forgive themselves.
All right, we've got to stop it right there, panel, but I thank you for your comments and your insights tonight. Much more ahead in terms of this case. And a special thank you to you, Dan, for your courage to stand up and speak out. All right, stay with us. Coming up, we're talking one-on-one with Detroit's Interim Police Chief James White about crime and how to stop it as Let It Rip continues. Welcome back to RIP. With us now, Interim Detroit Police Chief James White. Chief White, thank you so much.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
Well, you have been on the job just a few days, no time to celebrate. Instead, it's been trial by fire. Is this what you expected?
Well, I mean, this is what I was prepared for. Certainly, it was what I was prepared for.
You know, there's been a rising tide of violence across the country and, of course, here in Detroit. What do you think are the causes and how do we stop it?
Yeah, there's a number of things that lead to crime. I mean, we've talked about it, and departmentally, I certainly have talked about it in counseling where there are a lot of social issues that drive crime. My job here is to make sure that I do everything that I possibly can to keep everyone who lives, works, and visits this city safe. But there are a number of issues that drive crime.
You know, when you look at what happened in Greektown, when you have young people apparently taunting officers, jumping on their backs, trying to goad them into using force, has something fundamentally changed in our society?
Well, I think, a lot of it's driven by what I think is just a sentiment towards policing around the country. And some people are emboldened by that, I feel. But I couldn't be prouder of our officers in the way that they've reacted, to some of the rise in violence and certainly the violence towards them. They are truly an example of professional policing that should be modeled around this country. They're utilizing their tactics, they're utilizing their training, they're exercising de-escalation techniques, just textbook work. And again, I wasn't surprised, but it certainly fills my heart to see our officers work so hard to ensure that they are policing the right way.
Of course, the death of George Floyd sparked a movement against police brutality, but has it also made it more challenging for officers to do their jobs?
Well, I think it makes, the tragic events of last year make it difficult for everyone. I mean, the police have a lot of work to do to earn the community trust. We're privileged here in Detroit. I have friends and family all around the country in law enforcement, and they don't enjoy the relationships that we have with our community. But it takes a lot of work to maintain those relationships. But it makes it hard for both sides. I mean, I certainly understand and support a number of issues that's come out of that movement. But with relationship building and policing, it's part of policing. We're not a them and us mentality or group. We are the people that we serve. We are the community in which we serve.
And I think that has made a big difference. That's why you didn't see the violence and the looting in Detroit that you saw in other cities.
Absolutely.
But in the last few weeks, Detroiters are telling me they're so happy that the COVID cases are declining, that restrictions are being lifted, but they're also worried about what they fear will be a summer of shootings across the city, in the streets. What would you tell them?
Well, we certainly hope not. And we're certainly doing everything that we can. The 5-point plan that we talked about today is about community engagement. It's about officers on the ground and patrolling those areas that are subject to a rise in crime based on some of the data and some of the information that we have. But we're only one piece of the puzzle, right? A lot of this is community. It's making better decisions. It's not using weapons to resolve disputes. It's not carrying illegal weapons. It's utilizing some decorum. I mean, not getting into these complex or not really complex disputes, but just disputes that you make the decision to resolve permanently, right? I mean, when you're using temporary situations and making permanent decisions, and when you have a shooting or you have a homicide, it's not just the victim's family, but the perpetrator's family. It affects both sides. So we're hoping for a safe summer. That's what this 5-point strategy is about, is keeping all Detroiters safe. It's keeping our visitors safe. People who want to come to our city and enjoy the beautiful parks that we have, we're okay with that. But you're going to have to conduct yourself a certain way to do so. You're not going to be able to drag race in our city. You're not going to be able to come here and use our city as a playground and go home, disrespecting our residents, disrespecting our community, all the hard work that we've all done. We know where we've come from with our city, and the recovery is real. But we want to maintain that recovery and continue that momentum. And to have someone come here and disrespect our residents, drag racing in the streets, running into their homes, putting their kids in danger, that's just unacceptable, and it's not going to be tolerated.
Were you surprised to learn that some people who don't even live in the city look at Detroit as a place where they can come and break the law and get away with it?
No, I wasn't surprised, because the data supports that's a trend that's been growing. Of the weapons that we recovered last weekend, over half of those people weren't from the city of Detroit.
You also said today that Greektown, the riverfront, and some parks would be the main focus, but does that interfere with your ability to respond to crimes in the neighborhoods?
Absolutely not. The neighborhoods are number one. The focus will be the neighborhoods. And I was so happy when I brought the mayor the plan. He gave me 4,000 hours of overtime. And that's important. Internally, that may not make a lot of sense to the listeners or the viewers, but what that means to me is that I can deploy my officers that are working patrol in the community, in the neighborhoods, and not have to impact them, and then use those overtime dollars for the special detail assignments for the summer crowd control or summer crowd management with that overtime dollar. And that makes sense to us. So I was very happy to get that from the mayor, and I think that's going to help us tremendously and not impact the neighborhoods. Those 911 calls for service will be paramount and not impacted to our business day in and day out.
Not only do you have decades of experience in law enforcement, you have also lost someone to violence. Your uncle was murdered when you were only 8 years old. I understand the crime was solved, but was justice achieved?
No, and my family still wears the wounds of that time. Justice was not achieved for him or the other person who was murdered in that home. In fact, the perpetrator was acquitted. But our family is confident that the police made the right arrest in that case.
Well, in addition to your law enforcement background, you bring also a set of skills to your job that many people in that position don't have. You have a master's degree in counseling. You're a licensed counselor. How does that influence what you do as chief?
Yeah, it certainly informs a lot of my decision making. It gives me an understanding and makes me acutely aware of the impact of violence in our community, but also on our police officers. You know, we report these stories, or you report these stories day in and day out that are tragic, horrific. And sometimes we forget that on those rollover accidents or those homicide scenes or those babies that are injured, like the one we had the other night in the auto accident, there's a police officer that has to go to those scenes and see that. There's an EMS driver that has to go to that scene and see that, a firefighter that has to go to that scene and see that. And that impacts you. It impacts you day in and day out. And for all that work, you get to do it all over again tomorrow. And years of seeing that kind of tragedy and horror, and then having to make that real in your life and in your mind day in and day out can create a very stressful dynamic for first responders. So, you know, I'm acutely aware of that impact, and I'm going to do everything I can to make sure that we have the appropriate support services for our men and women that do this amazing work day in and day out.
Chief, I also want to ask you about the media's role in all this. You know, we cover those stories, those tragedies that you spoke of, but I wonder what we can do, in your estimation, so that we inform the public, but also become a part of making this city what it should be.
That's a great question, Hugh, and thank you for asking. I think balance is important. You know, fairness, I think you all have been fair with us, but I think continued fairness and reporting the information completely. You know, we had an incident a few nights ago where it was reported that one of our officers, you know, used excessive force in a situation where the officer was just doing an incredible work, witnessing an assault of a female passenger of a vehicle. Where she was punched, you know, multiple times in her face and head area. And an officer responded, assisted, attempted to take the perpetrator into custody. There was a scuffle. The perpetrator took the officer to the ground, and officer was hospitalized. You know, the story was reported a little bit differently than all the facts revealed. So I think once we get the facts, it would be helpful if we show the facts completely. And I think additionally, there's some great stories in law enforcement. You know, we handle thousands and thousands of runs a week, and officers do incredible work. We've had 3 barricaded gunmen in the past 72 hours. 2 of them were mentally ill. 1 of them was a shooter, violent mental. We took all 3 into custody without incident, including the one today just a few hours ago. So continuing to report that balance and showing the great work that the men and women do would be very, very helpful. And the good stories in the city of Detroit. I mean, you know, certainly the 5% gets 100% of the attention, but there's 95% of people that come through our town without incident, enjoy our parks, enjoy our downtown, have a great time, and go home. So those stories are good as well.
And we will be sure to cover them. Look, Chief White, I know that the Board of Police Commissioners is now in the process of a national search, but sometimes you can find what you're looking for right in your own backyard. I want to tell you that you always have a seat at this table. You're welcome to join us anytime. Chief James White, we wish you all the best of luck, not only for you and your family, but also for the city we all love. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, Hugh. Thank you.
Stay with us. Final thoughts ahead. Time for final thoughts, Charlie.
You know, I want to go back to the football players, and I believe they have the courage now to talk about it because things are changing. If you're abused now, I think it's okay to talk about it, because if we're going to solve this abuse, this sexual abuse, we've got to talk about it and feel comfortable enough to blame these people and talk about it. That will solve the problem.
Meanwhile, Charlie, a lot of people talking with COVID cases declining, going back to the way we were. I say no, let's not do that, especially if that means going back to sexual abuse and crime. Let's instead move forward to a better version of who we are. That is the way forward. Thanks for watching this edition of Let It Rip.